Thank you, Laura, so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. Thank you to Tri-Faith for hosting this opportunity to share some thoughts with you and hopefully hear some thoughts from you about the Ten Commandments and how they implicate religious freedom. And just on a kind of personal, professional note, I knew of Rabbi Azriel, who was instrumental in helping to get Tri-Faith going, just because the Reform rabbinate is such a small kind of network in this country. And I don't know him well personally, I just met him at conferences and things. I had heard kind of about this vision for many years, and so to actually be here and to get to see it is really exciting for me, because I always thought it was such a great model for how to build community and build religious community in a way that celebrates and maintains pride in particularistic details of who you are and identity of who you are, at the same time as you're sharing public space and sacred space with each other and across community lines. So thank you for doing this here. Thank you for inviting me and welcoming here. And thank you for the work you do on an ongoing basis through Tri-Faith. So where to begin? Well, let's start with the First Amendment, which is in many ways the backbone of my work at BJC and our work. We've been around for about 90 years. And for much of that time, the center of our work has been First Amendment litigation, mostly through amicus briefing, which is when an organization that's not a party to a case writes a brief for that we submit to the Supreme Court, usually Supreme Court in our case, but in some instances lower courts, where we share from our expertise and unique view something that we believe adds value to the case that the parties might not be able to share themselves, that we believe ideally helps the court in making its decision. A lot of nonprofit and advocacy groups have an amicus briefing strategy that because they want to help shape the outcome of litigation. So that's a pretty common thing in the world I'm in. And for us, it's about expertise around the First Amendment. And so you have it in front of you as a reminder, as a little civics refresher. The beginning of the First Amendment is the two religion clauses. These are the ones that we care about day in and day out. Of course, we care about the rest of the amendment as well, but these are the ones we really work on. Coming after this is freedom of speech, freedom of press, and freedom to assemble. So first we have, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These known as first the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, working in many cases in a complementary way to keep the government out of the business of sponsoring religion or advancing religion, and also making sure that it doesn't do anything that inhibits our practice of religion. Sometimes those are one and the same. Sometimes they can run into some tension, and that's something we can talk about as we go. This is paired with a picture of Roger Williams, not exactly a founding father, but important as a Baptist leader because he was a famous dissenter, I'll put it that way. And Baptists, I've been learning since I started work with BJC, about the time that you started with Tri-Faith, about 6 months ago. Since there were such people called Baptists in the 17th century in England, and then as they migrated to these shores, they were at the forefront of fiercely advocating for religious freedom and against church-state, against church establishment by the state. So they got kicked out of a lot of places because they were annoying to people who wanted to establish churches. And the irony of that generation of the colonial period and the early republic is that the folks who had fled religious persecution in England came here and then in many cases set up their own system of religious persecution by establishing their preferred version of the church. Just not the one we had in England, but we're going to do it our way and also exclude other people. So Baptists were among the fierce opponents of that. Roger Williams was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony for criticizing their Puritanism, and he went and founded Rhode Island as a kind of haven for Quakers and Jews and everyone else who didn't fit into the established churches and other colonies. He did not stay Baptist his whole life. That's another thing I've learned about Baptists, is that sometimes because they put such a prime value on individual conscience and freedom and individual relationship with the Bible, sometimes they went on to say, actually, there's this other sect or other denomination that fits my conscience better. And he ended up leaving, but he did found one of the first Baptist churches in the country. He also has informed my thinking about pluralism with his emphasis on a certain New Testament story from Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and the tares, the wheat and the weeds, when Jesus says to the disciples that he shares a story of farmhands who go to their master and say, the wheat crop is being mixed with weeds that are growing there. Should we try to clear out the weeds? And the head farmer says, no, because if you do that, you'll destroy the wheat also. That we'll leave that till the time of the harvest. A few verses later, the disciples ask Jesus, what did that mean? That doesn't always happen in the New Testament, I realized. That they ask him, what did that parable mean? And he actually explains it. So here it happens, and he says, that is like believers and non-believers today. It is not our job as the farmhands, or it's not your job as the farmhands, to separate the wheat and the weeds. That is God's job at the harvest, meaning at the end of days, or however you define that. And for Roger Williams, that was a way to say, I may think you're going to hell, but that is God's problem, not my problem. It's not for me to deal with that now. We have to figure out a way to live together peaceably, and God will figure all that out at the harvest. And I kind of love that approach to pluralism. It doesn't require you to compromise on your own beliefs, but it does create a kind of framework for living together. And the history of Europe was also a history of tearing each other apart over religious differences. And many of the founders ended up wanting the First Amendment because they wanted to avoid, and the Establishment Clause in particular, they wanted to avoid that European history where religion was a perennial source of conflict. Beyond the First Amendment, we also try to think and talk about religious freedom as something that is not just a legal right, but something we live and experience in our lives every day. It's one thing to have legal protection and a lawsuit you can file if something happens. Another thing to feel free to practice religion every day in every way you decide to do that. This campus is a great example of what living religious freedom looks like when different faiths can express themselves freely in community with others. We think a lot about that in public schools because a lot of our work involves advocating for religious freedom in public schools. Unfortunately, there are a lot of attempts to impose religion in public schools and on public schools. It is one of the main battlegrounds for that issue right now. The Ten Commandments are one of the tools, or how do I put it? Yeah, one of the tools or texts that is used as a weapon in that battle to impose religion on public schools. And so I'll get to that in a moment, talking about why that matters, or specifically about the Ten Commandments, but this is in a more affirmative way to think about what does it look like to have religious freedom in a classroom? How do students experience that? It's about creating a space where they can express themselves religiously and have equal access to education regardless of what religion or no religion they espouse. That means protecting rights and limits under both clauses of the First Amendment. That means inclusive learning environments. That means promoting religious literacy. That's an important one, and I think something that's probably near to the heart of Tri-Faith. Because a lot of times these debates happen, and I'll talk about this when we get to the specifics of the Ten Commandments. Elected officials talk about religious ideas and texts and matters seemingly very ignorant about what they actually are dealing with. So religious literacy would go a long way to helping us even have these debates because we could at least agree on what we're talking about, which we don't even have some of the time. So, getting to the Ten Commandments specifically. To understand where we are now, we have to look back on some of the earlier cases involving the Ten Commandments being displayed in public places. There is a 1980 case called Stone v. Graham, where the Supreme Court struck down a Kentucky law very much like laws we're seeing today that required posters of the Ten Commandments in public schools. And the Supreme Court applied something called the Lemon Test, which I'll come to later, and said that this law had no secular purpose, it has a religious purpose, and therefore it doesn't pass the test for an Establishment Clause violation, and it can't fly, it's unconstitutional, and those posters had to come down. That test becomes, that case becomes important in the cases I'll talk about in the next couple slides about what we're dealing with now. Another couple important cases, both handed down in 2005. One was McCreary County versus ASOU of Kentucky, which involved a courthouse display of the Ten Commandments, among other things, in a Kentucky courthouse. Again, again, like in the Stone case, the court struck down the display, and it had to do with finding, again, a predominantly religious purpose. That one is a little bit more nuanced because the display went through several variations because the state was trying to make it more contextualized and historical looking, so it didn't come across as a religious display. But the court kind of looked back at the original intent of the display and said it's religious in nature. At the same time, the court decided, in some ways, the opposite direction. In the Van Orden v. Perry case, this involved a monument, like a stone monument of the Ten Commandments on the Texas State Capitol grounds. And the court said that one does not violate the Establishment Clause because it has historical value, it's a passive monument, it's not displayed in the government building. I should also say it's part of the grounds that have other monuments of other texts and other historical markers. So it can be seen as having more of a secular meaning and not a religious purpose to promote religion. So the monument stays. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. The one on the right is the Kentucky courthouse display. And you'll notice that they did add the Kentucky Constitution, or at least part of it, and the Mayflower Compact as their attempt, I think, to put it in more of a historical context kind of display. But again, the court didn't buy that. The one on the left and at the bottom, sort of zoomed out, that's the Texas State Capitol, and this is the monument that was donated by Fraternal Order of the Eagles to the state of Texas. One thing I want to ask, does anyone recognize the symbol down in the two symbols down where the red arrows are? The red arrows are my addition, those are not on the monument. Also, by the way, so at the top, I think that is the Ten Commandments in Greek. That's the best I could decide. The pictures I could find were not super clear. I'm pretty sure it's not Hebrew though. And I'm actually also just noticing there's that the pyramid eye that also appears on the money.
That's Masonic.
That's not, yeah, it's Masonic, right? That's not Christian, not exactly. Anyone can tell me what the P with the X, that's not really what it's called, but what it looks like. Anyone know what that is?
Is that Christ?
It does stand for Christ. It's the Chi Rho. This is the first two Greek letters of Christ, and it's an ancient symbol meant to depict Christ, or to stand for Jesus, and of course the Jewish star next to it. So what does it mean to have a Jewish star and that symbol? Sort of leave that to you as a kind of open question. I have my own thoughts on it, and we can come back to some of that. But that reminds me of using the word Judeo-Christian, which I have all kinds of issues with anyway. I think it's a much more complex word than people use it to mean. So when I see that visually, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm not sure what the Jewish star is doing. I guess I'll put it that way. If that's a Christian display, can it also be Jewish? I don't know. But that's a question about the text too that we'll get to, the Ten Commandments themselves. This is really about that. So, a little bit in the development of the Lemon Test that I mentioned before, that the court used in the Stone case to strike down the Kentucky law of Ten Commandments in public schools. In the Kennedy case, which was 4 years ago, the football coach praying at the 50-yard line, where the court said he has a free exercise right to do that because it's on his own time, it's a private prayer. On the other side, saying it's an Establishment Clause problem. Actually, the school district itself was trying to avoid an Establishment Clause problem by not having a school employee lead a public prayer. But if you define it as a private personal prayer on his own time, as the court did, maybe ignoring some important facts, but that's for another conversation. If you define it that way, then you can say free exercise right to pray as he chose in that moment. The other thing that happens in the Kennedy case is the court, written there by Justice Gorsuch, says that Lemon is dead. Meaning we're not going to apply the Lemon test anymore when it comes to Establishment Clause questions. The Lemon test has 3 prongs. First, does the law have a secular purpose? Does it have a secular effect, meaning does it advance or inhibit religion? And 3, does it involve excessive government entanglement with religion? It's particularly the first prong that this court, Gorsuch and this court, have the most issue with as far as secular purpose, or does it have a religious or secular purpose, partly because they think it's very hard to determine legislative purpose anyway. Like which legislators, how do you read that, which record do you look at? And there's a whole now emerging body of law around how do you actually do an Establishment Clause case? What do you actually use to evaluate whether something is a violation? History and tradition is the main headline there. If you know what that means, you welcome to BJC, come work with me. But it's a little bit unclear what exactly history and tradition means. In other cases, some of the justices have referred to things they call the hallmarks of establishment. They look to things like literally a church set up by the state. Things like taxing people to pay for Christian preachers, which did happen in the early colonial period. So how much does what you're analyzing today have to look like one of those things is an open question. They're looking for a historical analogy, basically. It seems, at least, at the Supreme Court level. Very open question also how lower courts should deal with the history and tradition test, because judges are not historians, and like which history and whose and what do you emphasize and how do you analogize? Lots of judgment calls involved. Why is this an issue now? Because the Stone case did apply the Lemon test in striking down the Ten Commandments law. So how should we think about Stone now? Did Kennedy, in saying Lemon is dead, also do away with every case that ever relied on Lemon? Didn't say that, but also didn't say not that. It did refer positively to some cases that also relied on Lemon, like Levy-Weissman, which had to do with the prayer at a high school graduation. So there's a live debate now, even among appellate and Supreme Court judges, on how much of Lemon is dead, and what about other precedents that relied on Lemon in some part, but have not been specifically overruled, like Stone. That's the conversation that happened at the Fifth Circuit argument earlier this year in a case we were watching closely. There are more than three lawsuits, but lawsuits involving Ten Commandments in public schools statutes in these 3 states, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas. The Fifth Circuit in January combined the Texas and Louisiana lawsuits to hear the oral arguments together. And one of the things that came out in that oral argument conversation was this issue of, if you're relying on Stone for us to strike down these laws, how do you deal with the Lemon problem? Several of the judges hit them really hard on that. Some of them did not take that route, but that is why I raised the Stone precedent, because it's a very clear precedent, and if it applies, it's very easy to strike down these laws. But for some of the judges, because of its reliance on Lemon, there's got to be other analysis that happens now for under history and tradition to analyze these cases. One of the judges on the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit is the appellate court that includes, I'm not going to tell you all the states because I can't remember them, but Louisiana and Texas both in the Fifth Circuit. Arkansas is in the Eighth Circuit, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So one of the justices just kept hitting away over and over at the lawyer for the families who are contesting the law, asking, give me a historical precedent, give me a historical analogy for why posters of the Ten Commandments in a public school classroom violate the Establishment Clause. Just give me something historical that I can compare that to. And the lawyer was a little bit cagey about it, and I wondered about that, and then in more discussions realized that you have to be careful at the appellate level, because you don't want to box yourself into something that when it goes up to the Supreme Court, you regret being locked into. So it was a little bit cagey, I think probably for good reasons, but one of the things that came out was the idea that it's turning a public school into a church. Maybe one way to think about it. On the other side, there's all kinds of research, a little bit cherry-picked about how, like the New England Primer you'll hear about, which was an early textbook that did include the Ten Commandments, but one of the problems is public schools didn't exist at that time. There was no such thing as a public school, so what kind of analogy are we really looking for? How do we do that historical work when it's such a different setting? What does that look like now? So that's one of the problems in bringing cases like this. How do you get over that hurdle? The Fifth Circuit ruled in February on the Louisiana case, which is called Roque v. Brumley, so I didn't put the names on there, but Roque v. Brumley. We did have an amicus brief in that case, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, our arguments, but in that case, the Fifth Circuit ruled on an issue of standing, throughout the case on standing, which courts love to do when they can, because it allows them to avoid ruling on the merits. And in this case, because the Louisiana statute was a little bit more open-ended on what the posters have to look like, in terms of what gets put on the walls in Louisiana classrooms, the Texas statute is very specific about the text, the size of the poster, dimensions, literally dimensions 11 by 16, and how it has to be on the wall. So they threw out the Louisiana case on standing, saying, we can't say it's a facial violation of the Establishment Clause because we can't say that in every possible case, these posters are gonna violate the First Amendment. We haven't seen the posters you're talking about yet. So what that would look like is coming back with an as-applied challenge, potentially saying, these posters in these schools, because of these details, violate the First Amendment. And then having the courts, it's harder to do, and then it may only apply to those posters going forward, so it's more complicated. One thing I'll note is that Judge James Ho on the Fifth Circuit, possibly the most conservative, and on various short lists for the Supreme Court, wrote a concurrence in that decision where he said, I would not have thrown this out on standing, I would have actually thrown it out on the merits. I would have been happy to rule on the merits that this statute is fine because the Ten Commandments are part of our history and tradition, and there's no problem under the Establishment Clause. So he's very clear on where he stands on that one. Some of my coalition partners were actually sort of encouraged that no one else joined that concurrence. So I guess you gotta find good news where you can. But that's where that left. And I think a little bit of good news, probably also they did not rule on the Texas case at the same time. Presumably, if they were going to throw out the Texas case on standing, they would have done it at the same time. The fact that they didn't yet, and they still haven't ruled on it, makes us maybe think that there's something more nuanced they're going to do with the Texas law because it's more specific about what the posters have to look like. In the Eighth Circuit, we are watching the appeal of the Arkansas law. It's a little bit different in that it, not only in K through 12, but also it requires posting in higher education. So there are posters that have gone up in the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville classrooms. And I was saying to someone earlier that that's less problematic for courts in some ways because as much as they're concerned about religious coercion for children and indoctrination for children, college students, kind of adults, kind of less of a problem about are they going to be indoctrinated by having these posters on the wall in a college classroom. So that might change the outcome. I don't know. We'll have to see if that plays into it at all. Interestingly, while this appeal is still pending, the district court in Arkansas actually granted a permanent injunction in the same case because the summary judgment motions were filed. And that was just recently. That was this week, I think. Was that yesterday? Whatever it was. It was earlier this week. And it was great. It's a great decision. It's written really well. And the judge basically said, there's no reason to display a sacred religious text in every classroom other than proselytization. And how could you even with historical context, how would you justify putting the Ten Commandments in a chemistry or calculus classroom? So, some good language there out of the district court in Arkansas. Our brief in that Eighth Circuit case talks about the Establishment Clause problem, even aside from the question of whether a poster on a wall coerces children into a certain belief, which is one of the arguments out there, to which one of the Fifth Circuit judges in the oral argument said, children don't have to look at it, they can just look away.
Oh my God.
Think about that one. But part of our argument is, it violates the Establishment Clause just that the state has selected a particular religious interpretation to value over all others. By choosing, and I'll show you in a moment, a particular sectarian translation of the Ten Commandments. That in itself is something the Establishment Clause, in our point of view, is designed to prevent. The state is not allowed to resolve religious disputes, is another way to put it. So let's look at that more closely. In the context also of the Texas law. Here's what the Texas law, called SB 10, here's how it defines, here's how it names the requirement. I'm not going to read all of it, but down in section B1, it has to be a poster or frame copy. It has to include only the text of the Ten Commandments as provided by subsection C, which I'll show you in a moment, in a size of typeface that is legible to a person with average vision from anywhere in the classroom. And I was wrong, I said 11 by 16. I forgot I'm in Texas, it's gotta be bigger in Texas. Be at least 16 by 20, and must read as follows. And this, by the way, is the text, also, not just in the Texas law that did pass, but in the Tennessee bill that is currently being debated in the Tennessee legislature. Same text. Not a coincidence, by the way. Same text. This is basically a conglomeration of King James Version. And I say that because even within the Bible, there are different versions of the Ten Commandments. Exodus and Deuteronomy being the main instances of that happening. Here's how the state has decided they should look on the wall of our public schools. So before I move on, just some conversation or question and answer if you have any. But how does this strike you? Especially for those of you who, well, whatever religion you are, I'm curious about your thoughts on, like, what does it feel like to you for the state to select this and put it on the wall of a classroom or every classroom? But particularly if you're a Christian, how do you react to this?
My reaction is I was a teacher, and that language would have to be explained to children. So if they ask, what does covet mean? What does adultery mean? What does this mean? Then I would be violating the First Amendment for sure. Doing that, is that what Texas is hoping for? That the kids will start asking questions.
Should I repeat the question, or did everyone hear?
And then that becomes the indoctrination, right?
Yeah.
If that's what they're hoping for, which I don't know if that's, but this would not be very understandable to most, especially elementary students. The language is archaic for one thing, so.
Yes,
Yeah.
so, yes, this is a great point. Should I repeat the question? Yeah, so the question is coming from a teacher's perspective. There's a lot of language on here I would have to explain to a child in a classroom. I mean, you're talking about K through 12, so what is the kindergartner going to do with some of this? And that you've anticipated a lot of what has come up in Texas, not on the litigation side, but on the advocacy side. The teachers groups are up in arms about having to put this up because of that. That's one of the problems. What do I as a teacher, like, if a kid asks me about this, what are my rights? Not just rights, but like, what should I not do as a teacher? It just invites teachers to wade into a really murky area. How do you explain I am the Lord thy God in historical context to a kindergartner.
There's nothing historic about it.
I don't know what you do. And even, yes, questions?
Yeah.
From the Jewish lens, it's not saying I am the Lord your God that took you out of Egypt.
Yes. Yes, I'll come to that in a moment, but I'm glad you raised
It's
it.
the jot and tittle.
Like, it's kind of inaccurate.
Yes, this version leaves out, like if you actually look at where it sits in the Bible itself, there's a lot more text and a lot more detail. They've taken out a lot of that. So that's why I said it was sort of a conglomeration of King James language, leaving out some of those details. Right, also, right, so yes, the Jewish perspective on it. And that is another problem that we'll look at more closely, that Jews and Protestants and Catholics define the commandments differently and number them differently. We'll talk about it on the next slide, but I want to sit with this for a little bit longer. We have an organizer, part of BJC, who's full-time organizing in the North Texas area, Dallas-Fort Worth. And one of the things they're working on is we have produced on our website resources for teachers and parents on how to deal with these posters going up. One of the things we say is that if your district is putting them up, so the one nuance I didn't mention about the Texas law is it doesn't require spending school money on the posters, but it has a kind of a contingency clause. If the posters are donated to the school district, then the school district is required to display them. So, as you can imagine, there are groups ready and willing to donate posters, and that's been happening in a number of districts. There are also, because there are 3 lawsuits, and there's 20-something districts, many of the biggest ones, that are under an injunction at the lower court level to not enforce this law. So it's a bit of a mishmash, and there's a class action suit as the 3rd one that's been filed that would cover all of the districts. But now the fact that the Fifth Circuit dismissed one of them on standing is a problem for the others. So we're going to see how that plays out. But yes, resources for teachers and parents to know, like, hey, part of the advice we give is if your district starts to put them up and your principal or superintendent tells you to put them up, you should comply with that, probably, because otherwise you could be disciplined. We're not going to advise teachers not to do it, but also be really careful how they talk about it. We even have some materials for how to write a letter to parents if the posters are going up, to kind of warn parents about what's happening in a religiously neutral way. So that's the question we're dealing with. The other problem with this, well, there are many problems, but one of the other problems is when people talk about this as a foundation of American law, maybe you could argue that from here down, you could have a conversation about ways that biblical law and American law intersect, maybe, but above this line, what are we talking about? This is like deeply religious principles and values. Now, truth be told, there were moments in the colonies when they actually passed laws about things like this. They like outlawed idolatry and outlawed adultery. Well, that's further down. I'm not sure how we feel about making adultery criminal, but it was in some places for a long time. It is not, but there were laws against breaking the Sabbath. Like these things were laws in our history. So in that sense, yes, actually it is. But it's sort of like, let's not go back there. It's not the kind of history you want to repeat. So just putting it up there with no context.
Blue laws about open to business.
Blue laws, yeah, well, we still have those in some places, right? Yeah.
And it seems like there's more than 10.
Okay, well, so we'll get to that in a moment. Which 10? And also, I am the Lord thy God, it's not a commandment.
There's still more than 10.
Of course, what they're called in Hebrew, Seret Dibrot, it doesn't necessarily mean commandments, like the 10 sayings or utterances or something. Not quite commandments, but
Nowadays, more suggestions.
Suggestions. But that is I am the Lord thy God is also not a suggestion. It's just, it's sort of a preamble, maybe.
Yeah.
Of course, this doesn't exist as a set apart piece of it's just part of the biblical narrative too, so. But the part that says Ten Commandments is not in the Bible. By the way, I should point that out, I didn't notice that before. That's in the Texas statute, that's not in the Bible. So there was a question over there,
So it seems like the easiest test of the secularity would be put this up in your classroom, surround it by the Jewish version, the Islamic version, Hindu scripture, and see if you get fired.
There are some folks talking about that, and we even had an early idea to design kind of like alternate or complementary posters that would go up next to it, but part of why we didn't do that was that we got some indication from folks doing the litigation that that would not help litigation if there were other posters going up in classrooms that would muddy the scenario. They didn't actually want us to like contribute to a situation where the posters became okay.
Exactly.
Just part of the problem with that. But that a lot of us had that initial instinct too, actually. But could you have a poster that's something Ten Commandments related that also talks about similar laws in other religions? Maybe, but also shouldn't that be part of like a curricular module and not just like always on the wall?
Exactly.
That would be my suggestion. It's another problem with this, it's like has nothing to do with curriculum or anything.
So, what do they say that they're doing with this? I mean, what is the reason, if it's not to force religion on people? The people who are making these bills, what do they say that why they're doing it?
It depends on the legislature and the legislator, but the Tennessee one is pretty explicit. It's about, and there it actually pairs it, and I'll show it later on. Do I have that coming up? Yeah, that's a bit later on, but I can talk about it. There they pair it with a quote from the Declaration and a quote from the Constitution, and say things like, it's one of what we're considering significant historical documents, or documents of historical significance. So it's a part of trying, in their view, or in their words, it's trying to promote understanding among school children of founding values, important founding values of the country, important founding documents of the country. And they're joining the Ten Commandments into those documents by saying they are a major inspiration for American law and inspired the founders.
I see.
And they looked at things like the Supreme Court frieze around the top of the courtroom where there is a sculpture of Moses holding the tablets, but there's Hebrew chiseling on them. I think it's just the first letter of each one, not even, or just the Hebrew numbers. I'd have to look at it again. It's not the full text. But there's a bunch of other lawgivers throughout the ages around the frieze. So certainly contextually there, it's very easy to say this is just about the history of lawgiving. That's different than this. I think in important ways, but I guess it's arguable.
It's my understanding that most of the major religions have essentially the same commandments, the ideas. How does that fit in with
Maybe.
all of this?
Well, that is one of the arguments that some of these supporters of this will make, certainly when it comes to Christianity and Judaism. And they'll talk about how many religions have, and many cultures and countries have laws against killing and stealing and maybe some sort of lying under oath and, I don't know, taking your neighbor's stuff? I don't know. I mean, what coveting means in the biblical context is a whole other lecture I could give. That it probably doesn't just mean wanting. It probably means something more active than just wanting in the Hebrew, which is very different. Here in the English covet, it looks like it's policing thought. I think in the original, in the Hebrew, I think it means something more than that. I think it means something more like desiring with the intent to take. I think. But that's, like I said, a whole other lecture. But the fact that other religions might share similar principles, I personally don't think that solves the problem, because this is a specific religious text from a sectarian translation of a particular religious book. And it's not like the legislature is saying, we want to highlight principles that are shared by a bunch of religions, so here's a list of those principles. That would be one thing. But it's not doing that.
But there are so many people in this country who believe that this country was founded on the Christian religion, that this is a Christian.
I think there we're getting to the fundamental problem. That America, yes, then that the big project of ours now is what we call Christians Against Christian Nationalism. The BJC initiative we founded about 6-7 years ago. We didn't invent that phrase, but we have named a project that. And you're right, define Christian nationalism in various ways, but one of the things that it does is try to Christianize America and also define America as a Christian nation founded by Christians for Christians, and then we need to return it to that now. You can probably add these white Christians as well for most of the ways it plays out. So with that, yes, with that kind of cultural undertone, I think these take on let's say a little bit more sinister meaning, trying to do this. Yes.
And Christian, I mean, maybe somebody could sue Catholics over the graven image thing? 'Cause they're sort of into it.
Right, if you made that into a law. Well, and there are folks who seem less and less fringe these days who want to make biblical law actual law in America, and biblical law as they define it. But yeah, you're going to outlaw idols? Catholic Church might have something to say about that. Let's look at this is some approaches to the different versions of the Ten Commandments in different religions. The first text is from a recent post on a website called wallbuilders.com, which is an educational and advocacy group that works to promote America as a Christian nation and Christian values. It was started by David Barton. I don't know if some of you know that name. He is now, back to the Texas scene, he is a content advisor on our State Board of Education overhaul of our social studies curriculum standards. And he testifies in a lot of court cases about that history and tradition piece, trying to show that the Bible has always been part of education, Christianity has always been part of our founding. A lot of the project is to Christianize the founding fathers, which is a really interesting project. You have to really grasp at straws if you're trying to find great examples of them being practicing Christians, because they were Christian in a certain sense, but not the sense that this group wants them to be, for the most part. Certainly Jefferson and Madison were not that kind of Christian. And even Washington, who did speak with religious language at certain public events and talked in terms of like praying to God for certain things. Not that kind of Christian. So, but here's what this website says about the differences between the commandments and about the commandments themselves. It's difficult to argue that any single work has had a greater or more far-reaching impact through 4 centuries of American life, law, and culture than the Ten Commandments. I mean, I'm not sure that's true, but okay. As such, the fact that their public display would become a matter of current debate or prohibition is almost unthinkable, and yet it is. And here's the part I'm mentioning. What distinguishes the various versions, and the fact that you put versions in quote, it's a little bit insulting to me as a Jew, but I'll talk about why, are primarily the different ways in which they are numbered. In the original Hebrew text, the Ten Commandments appear in paragraph form with no numbers or verses. Well, they are verses, but they aren't numbered as a list of 10. But as they were translated into subsequent texts, various faiths did the mic just die? I think it did. Is that one? There we go. As they were translated into subsequent texts, various faiths and branches of Christianity chose to number them differently. For example, the first command in the Jewish version is usually the prologue in most Protestant versions, but both contain the same content. Put a star there, not exactly. The different numberings are merely superficial man-made contrivances for ease of identification, but all versions cover the same subject matter. Now, that kind of dismissiveness of like scriptural nuance, I'm not surprised to see it on this website, Wall Builders. Where I am surprised to see it is in a Supreme Court decision written by Justice Scalia, which was the McCreary County case that I mentioned before, the display in the Kentucky courthouse, which the court struck down, but he dissented. And in footnote 12 of his dissent, here's what he said. Because there are interpretational differences between faiths and within faiths concerning the meaning and perhaps even the text of the commandments, Justice Stevens maintains, Justice Stevens who had written the majority opinion striking down the display. He maintains that any display of the text of the Ten Commandments is impermissible because it invariably places the government at the center of a serious sectarian dispute. Sorry, that's actually from Stephen's dissent from the other case, from the state capitol monument case. Stevens dissented there. And Scalia says, I think not. The sectarian dispute regarding text, if serious, talk about the gall of saying that. If serious is not widely known. I doubt that most religious adherents are even aware that there are competing versions with doctrinal consequences. I certainly was not. An amazing parenthetical. In any event, the context of the display here could not conceivably cause the viewer to believe that the government was taking sides in a doctrinal controversy. Now, I respect Justice Scalia a lot. I do disagree with him sometimes. He's a great writer and a brilliant jurist. But this is insulting. And I think also unprofessional, frankly.
With the serious, yes.
And it's surprising, the irony from a textualist to dismiss textual nuance this much with a kind of snide tone is really galling. And that's my introduction now to show you a chart of the Ten Commandments side by side. It's not perfect because, like you pointed out before, it leaves out a lot of the additional language that is in the Bible, but at least to give you a sense of, generally speaking, Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant, although there are also variations within that. So don't take this as the final word. But generally, ways that the commandments are numbered in these traditions. And I want to ask if you notice anything that's interesting or surprising, or what jumps out at you.
Not in the same order at all.
So the order is generally the same, but how they're divided is a bit different. Some of the problem is that they're abbreviated from the actual biblical verses, but just to give you the gist of what it is.
You brought this up, but the preamble piece, the Protestant version does not have I the Lord am your God at all.
Right.
So does that count, as you were saying, as sort of a commandment, or is it a preamble, or is it just a
Right.
statement?
Or is it combined with another one, like in the
Yeah.
Catholic version? I am God and you shall have no other gods. Whereas for the Jewish list, having no other gods is a separate one, and also actually not having graven images. This is the thing I don't like about this chart, it leaves out that part. Not having graven images is part of the not having other gods on the Jewish list. This chart didn't include it.
The difference between murder and kill.
Yes, that's a big one. Okay, notice, and that, by the way, yes, you shall not kill in the Catholic one, you shall not murder in the Jewish and Protestant. I don't love that also about this chart because it depends on which Protestant translation you use, because the King James Version says thou shalt not kill. And that is a Protestant translation.
Yeah.
What's the difference between killing and murdering? Maybe, more specifically.
Intentional, the intent
Just.
perhaps?
One might be legal.
Yeah.
One that's definitely illegal.
Murder.
If you shall not kill, like, can you ever go to war? You're never allowed to kill? Yeah, kill what? Well, sure, yes, that's my other bottom line about the Bible is that everything demands interpretation. Nothing can really be left at face value, which is true with most things, but with text generally. So I'm thinking as a parent of a child in school who now has to sit and look at a poster that says you shall not kill, and then has questions for me about like, well, that's not my religion. That's not how I interpret the Ten Commandments, and now I have to deal with the school, meaning the state, telling my child that that's the Ten Commandments. That seems to be a violation of something. I would say the First Amendment, and the other piece of that that's come up more recently is the idea of parents' rights to direct the religious upbringing of their child. It came up in a kind of converse way in Mahmoud case, if some of you may have seen that in the news. It was a group of families, Muslim, Catholic, and others, who sued a school district in Montgomery County outside of DC, Maryland side, that had, I won't get too in the weeds, but it had a curriculum involving books for the elementary school ages that included some books that were LGBTQ friendly, like a child who was getting ready to go to her uncle's wedding, and it happened that the uncle was marrying another man, but that wasn't the main thrust of the story. That kind of was incidental. It was really about the daughter not wanting to like let go of her favorite uncle, because she had such a good relationship with him, the niece, I mean. So when this first was instituted, families could opt out of learning with those materials, but at a certain point the school district decided not to do opt-outs anymore because, I don't know, it's too hard to administer, or maybe the books were like they weren't necessarily, we're gonna teach this book on this day, but they're like on the shelves and available. So the families sued. One of the things that the Supreme Court talked about when it affirmed the family's rights to the opt-out and forced the school district to restore the opt-out system. Well, first of all, the school kind of shot itself in the foot by having opt-outs and then taking them away. So don't do that if you're gonna, before you get sued, don't do that. But also the idea that these parents have a right to their child's religious upbringing. And so if they say, in my religion, same-sex marriage is wrong, homosexuality is wrong, and LGBTQ identity and gender identity more broadly is not something we believe in or support, that is my religious belief, and I have a right as a parent to make sure my child is not taught or indoctrinated in another religious belief, or a belief that's counter to that religious belief. It's not that it's another religious belief, because the books aren't religious. So we are seeing a kind of, maybe it's a converse or maybe it's just an extension of that, conversations around that now in Texas regarding Ten Commandments, and also a curriculum in Texas passed a couple years ago that has a lot of Bible material in it, an elementary school curriculum called Bluebonnet. Parents saying, I have a right to the religious upbringing of my child, and you can't force religious indoctrination in the classroom on my child. So something to watch for, how that plays out. What are the limits on that, and who gets to decide what's religious and not, and what kind of opt-outs are possible and available? All very open questions, and how lower courts will interpret that. There's a
I
hand.
wanted to ask about opt-out, since you just talked about it. If a student or a parent brings in religious material to explain a particular holiday in his or her religion, some districts are now allowing parents of kids to opt out of those discussions.
Interesting.
And it's not the school advocating, this is parents and kids bringing in materials about a particular holiday.
I haven't heard about that, but I have to think about that more. I wonder if now schools
My sister
are
teaches in Texas, and it's
Okay.
happening in her school.
in her school.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's schools just overly cautious about complaints and people raising grievances, and say, because it is the, I mean, you could argue it is the school giving the podium to a viewpoint. I don't know how I feel about that, but I'm just trying to play out the thinking there.
And has the court ruled that students can, they can have private prayer on the school grounds?
Yes, that's all allowed. There are many rights to religious expression that students do have in schools, and teachers now too. It's being emphasized in terms of private religious expression, and to gather, to create a religious student organization and have space. If other student organizations are allowed to do things, you have to allow religious organizations to do that. I hadn't thought about the opt-out thing. Is interesting. There is a question mark though on the legal and litigation side. If something is unconstitutional in our view anyway, providing an opt-out doesn't fix it. And you can't opt out of a poster on the wall also, unless you just look away from it, like the judge suggested.
Yes.
So I was just gonna point out, but you beat me to it, the murder versus kill distinction. I talked about the coveting piece of it. I also think, like, for kids of any religion that has more than one God, what does it do to them when there's a poster on the wall endorsed by the state that says only one God? It's not ideal. That's maybe even a stronger case in some ways of the state preferencing, the state resolving a religious dispute. That's not even as nuanced as which version and how we're interpreting it between Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant. It's like some religions don't ascribe to that at all, so it's not inclusive.
What about religions that don't have Sabbath?
Yeah, another problem. Problem by which I mean
Yeah.
problem for the purpose of trying to be inclusive here. Some religions don't have any deity.
No,
And
or a holy day.
say again?
A Sabbath.
A
What about
Sabbath.
religions that
Oh.
don't have Sabbath?
Yeah. Oh, also true. Yes. Yes, there are many, what is it, particularistic elements here. You even could say sectarian elements that do not invite a kind of universal sense of what are the principles that we're learning.
I'm just thinking raising your children with your beliefs, what if you're an atheist?
Yeah, I mean, that in some ways that's the starkest case of not forcing this down my throat.
Exactly.
I don't want any religion forced on my
Even
kids.
like Christmas is everywhere.
Well, yes, that's another problem.
Not
But
to get rid of Christmas, but that, you wouldn't want to because people are.
right, the other, so yeah, it is a I mean, and there's a lot of Christmas programming that is considered secular, or culturally Christmas or culturally Easter, I guess. But yeah, that's a conversation for another time, maybe. Just another thing I would like to point out, because I'm a rabbi and I revert to text study, because text study is what we do. This is me looking at the two different versions of the Ten Commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and thinking about also the fact that the King James, the Frankenstein King James, I call it Frankenstein of the King James, that Texas and Tennessee want us to put on the wall, flattens a lot of biblical nuance that I care about as a Jewish person. First of all, the commandment about Shabbat is different in the two versions. One says remember, and one says observe or keep. And that actually spawned a long line of rabbinic commentary about what does that mean, and are they the same or not, and how do we do both? And one interpretation, we have two candles on Shabbat because one is for each command for how to do that, remember and observe. I think the King James version, I think the version in Texas just said, what did it say? Remember. Oh, I would have guessed they would have used observe, but they said remember.
But to keep it holy.
Oh, to keep it holy. Yes, right. Which is the next part of the phrase.
Yeah.
And keep it holy is also in that. The other is, so that next part is the same, but then in the two versions. But then a little bit different and I also like they leave this part out in the text in the state version. I call it the state version. But I think this is a really important part of the commandment. The third line down, you shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female servant, maybe slave, that's a whole other conversation, your cattle or the stranger in your settlements. It's a little bit different over there in terms of the enumeration of people, but it's saying you have to rest because the people who work for you have to rest. That's a really interesting biblical principle. That's different than just like, I have an obligation to take some time out for myself. It's very different. And the version the state wants us to hang doesn't care about that at all.
The state also doesn't care about slavery either, right? They're trying
Well-
to erase it, so.
Well, yeah, in the State Board of Education fight we're in right now with the social studies change in Texas, they are definitely trying to remove a lot of references to slavery and also emphasize slavery that was perpetrated by Muslims, which is true, and like we can talk about that too, but they are trying to whitewash it a bit and how they're transforming those standards. The last one, it's maybe just a homiletical point, but one of them in Exodus it links Shabbat to creation, seventh day of creation, resting because God rested. And in Deuteronomy, and Exodus is when the commands are handed down from Mount Sinai. Deuteronomy is Moses' retelling of all of that to the Israelites. And you could do a whole class on just what's different in Deuteronomy than as it appeared before. And this is a good example. Here, Shabbat is because you were slaves in Egypt, and now you're free, and you have to observe that freedom by remembering to rest. Does that amount to a legal difference in terms of like American law? No, but, I mean, maybe not, but I'm just trying to point out the nuance of what these texts mean to me as a rabbi that is totally lost when you slap them up on a poster and then say, oh, now the kids have a sense of historical significance of what these texts mean. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's that these are twin traditions that we're tasked with living with. These, as Jews, at least, I can only speak for me in that sense. But we're something that imbues my practice of Shabbat is to say it's both because I'm commemorating God's day of rest and because I'm celebrating freedom from Egypt. Passover's coming up next week, so I'm primed for that theme. But I think in particular the one about resting because you are part of an economic system, and when you work, it implicates other people. That's important, and the Bible cares about that, but the state doesn't. Other thoughts and reactions? I have just a couple more things to look at, and then
I would
totally open it up. Yeah.
I mean, I know it's probably two different factions of courts, but how do they square, make it conspicuous with, basically just turn away? Like, if it's supposed to be conspicuous, it's supposed to be conspicuous, right?
Yeah, the question was, how do you square the idea that you should make the poster conspicuous, but also kids can just not look at it? They didn't try to do that.
Yeah.
It's a good question, though. I have that thought, too.
Yeah. And
The point is so that it's seen.
The
whole point.
The country for many, many years, I just finished a really good book on this. Country has been steeped in religiosity, and run by people who, for some reason, maybe you can weigh in on this, think it's important that we have these Christian precepts, but then they don't really practice them, right? So that's one thought, and then the second thought is, Christianity, which is what they claim to be embracing, says we're not under the law anymore, right? Christ came to emancipate us from being under the law, and when he was asked about the commandments, he only talked about basically two of them. And yet they've kind of, and then there's a third sort of addendum to that, which is to take care of your neighbor and honor the stranger, right? It's kind of interesting that the stranger's in there, but we're trying to just get rid of all the strangers. That solves that problem, right? We just get rid of the strangers.
Yeah, well, and there's a whole debate about what's the Christian approach to immigration enforcement.
Right.
And there was just an article, I think it was in the Eastern Chronicle, but I can't remember if it was like syndicated from another source, that outlined two very starkly different Christian views on how to deal with immigration enforcement. And they both look to the Bible in certain ways, but different texts that they're pulling from. But your question about, I do think there's a sort of irony in like the idea of certain strands of Christianity that teach that the law has been superseded in a sense by Jesus, but now also want biblical law to be the law of the land. I mean, those are now different. So part of that is just me pointing out there's a lot of variation within Christianity. There are folks who actually think that the Old Testament is a great source of law for America and should be the template for how I'm thinking of Douglas Wilson, who's on my mind a lot because I watch a lot of his reels now because I follow him, and so Facebook feeds me his stuff. And he does talk that way, that he wants to move us toward a biblical theocracy, basically, where the Old Testament is very useful to that kind of Christian because the New Testament doesn't have much in the way of civil and criminal law. It really doesn't. So when you want a law code, you gotta look at the Hebrew Bible. So there's that strand of Christianity that's saying, not only has it not been fulfilled or superseded or whatever term by Jesus. We actually need to reenact it now. I'm not sure how they feel about like keeping kosher and that kind of stuff. Question how it is. Or like not mixing wool and linen.
Yeah.
A bunch of other things too. Sorry, the mic died, so I'll try to keep my voice up. Jesus, raise your hand if you can't hear me at any point.
Sunday's not the
Shout out.
Sabbath, right?
Which day is the Sabbath? Yeah. Well, actually, it's kind of good we disagree, so we get a 2-day weekend. So
Yeah.
that's all right with me.
I don't know how you base something on a book that has so many interpretations. From historical events, understanding some of it, especially in the Old Testament, it seems, and in the New Testament, what did Jesus really mean when he said that?
I think that, certainly I agree with you, but more importantly, I think that is the insight that Jefferson and Madison and many others had for why you don't imbue religious interpretations with the force of government, because inevitably what happens is conflict.
Yes.
It doesn't sense.
Because there are so many different ways to interpret everything. So if one of them has the force of law and force of government, it's going to try to enforce its particular view on everyone else. And we've seen that throughout history everywhere. And the founding fathers were explicit about this. They literally wrote about how they didn't want that to happen here. And Madison in his, what's the famous, the remonstrance and remonstrance, how do you even pronounce that word? I don't know. It was something he wrote about partly in response to attempts to establish churches in Virginia and elsewhere, and also tax people to pay for Christian preachers. And he is relentless about the failed history of establishing Christianity in Europe for 1,500 years. He is not nice about it because the history is really ugly. And he said, we're trying to do something different here. And part of that involves not letting any one faith or sect have the power of government behind it. So yes, I'm certainly with you, but there are folks who feel differently. Another thing he said in that piece, I can't remember, he said it or Jefferson, but something like, once you, it's like, it may feel good to you to let your particular sect of Christianity, or to have, let Christianity, broadly speaking, have the power of the state behind it. But once you allow that to happen, nothing is going to keep someone else from making his particular version of Christianity the law of the land, or the next guy to make his version of whatever the law of the land. So the only way to live together without that is to not allow any of it, and yet still protect free exercise as well. So yeah, it's not that we don't want there to be churches that indoctrinate people, or even religious schools that indoctrinate people in their religion, but we don't think that those things should mix with public money and public and government power.
No, because then we go into culture as well, right? You're leading religion going into culture. So.
Well, that's a hard line to draw, but yeah. Just one sort of final note about, this is from the Tennessee statute that's being debated now. That, as I understand, originally introduced, it was what we call a permissive statute that school districts may display, but as it's moved through committees, it's now become a must display in a prominent place. And this is what it says they have to display: the 10 Commandments in the version I showed you before, the first sentence of the second paragraph of the preamble to the Declaration, which is the second bullet point, and the preamble to the Constitution. Although I only put the first sentence, but just to give you kind of a flavor of those. So one of my questions is, and for me it's a little bit of an open question, I'm just trying to think through, does that help? Does that fix the establishment problem?
No.
To have, and why not? Oh, just why not? I mean this genuinely as a question. What does adding those texts do? I didn't make a sample poster, but just picture like the version I showed you of the 10 Commandments and these two texts. I don't know in which order they have to be, but let's say the order they say. So 10 Commandments first, we hold these truths, we the people.
That should be the Constitution.
What does that change the meaning of the 10 Commandments on the poster? Does it
puts
change?
them on even ground, right?
So it elevates them to the level of founding document. Maybe it's worse, actually.
I mean,
It's worse
it
that way.
puts a place in people's hearts where they think that the country and the Ten Commandments are all like wrapped up in one big bundle.
This is a law of the land.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting also for Christians to be so interested in prioritizing a text that Jesus never said. Because as you pointed out, when they asked him that question, he had a different answer,
Yes.
actually. If you put those texts on the wall, that'd be different. May still be a problem, but I like them better.
You notice it's excluded the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
How convenient.
Yeah, forget your rights.
Yes, well, and to the question before about like posters of different faith traditions, one idea was to just put the Bill of Rights on the wall, or just put the First Amendment next to it.
Yeah.
was some people's idea.
Yeah. But why are we so concerned about all this? And I'm a Christian, and I don't have any interest in actually doing any of this
I'll
to
leave that.
anybody.
Why are we so concerned about this?
Yeah,
That's a
this
great
is all
question.
distractions for me right now.
I think there are a number of different answers to that.
There is personal interest behind it, there is distraction, politics, Epstein files, all kinds of distractions.
Distraction.
Oh, yeah.
Distraction may be part of it. I do think that there are also people who, like, if you see America as losing its way, as a nation that's supposed to be Christian, for Christians, and you see immigration happening, and you see the way that the complexion of America is changing, and that Christians will be in a minority at some point, and white Christians in some places already a minority.
Mhm. But then all minorities should be concerned. The Jewish people should be the first ones, and the white people.
We are concerned too. But
Exactly.
that's another conversation. Although it's related to all of it.
No,
But
it
my
is
point is
not.
like there's a kind of feeling like you're losing the country you thought you had, and you have to fight, almost like being cornered and lashing out to preserve it. I think that is some of what's happening with these. I mean, these bills are in a dozen states right now being considered.
Yeah, but look who's in power over the nation. Yeah, so,
The
it
problem
wasn't
is-
before a big issue, right?
Well, yes,
Not
and no,
at this
I think
level.
it's more visible. I
Yeah.
think it's more visible. You also have, it's more visible.
If they set this precedent, though, they, be careful what you ask for, right?
Exactly.
Because 10 years from now, the country may be even less Christian, right? And then all of a sudden,
I'll give you a perfect case
we're
in point.
putting up the Quran or the.
Yes.
So from the Department of Be Careful What You Wish For, which is important,
Yeah.
legislators should always think about that. In Texas, there is a new voucher program, state voucher program. And for a long time in Texas, it didn't pass, many years, because rural Republicans didn't want it. They were the ones who blocked it in Texas for a long time. Because in a rural community,
They control schools already.
your school is a pillar of your community. The superintendent is a respected leader, and there probably isn't a private school, or there may be not many. So they didn't want money going from the state to other schools. But in the last session, basically the White House called and threatened the governor and the lieutenant governor and the legislature and said, basically you have to do this. And it happened. And it's $1 billion price tag now, which we don't have. But my point with that is, end of last year, the state comptroller wrote a letter to the Attorney General asking if he could exclude from the voucher program private schools with, under the category of like designated foreign terrorist organization. There's an organization called CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations. So if a Muslim school hosted a CARE event, or if a school is owned or connected to a Chinese national, can we exclude those from the voucher program? And the Attorney General, if you know who he is, you're not surprised, he said yes. You can. He's not running for Senate. And so that is how the voucher program was started to be implemented. Private schools have to apply to receive the funds in addition to individuals getting into a lottery to get the funds. And several Muslim families and schools sued, and a federal judge recently ruled that their applications have to be considered by the state, and the timeline has to be extended so they have enough time to submit them since they were delayed by this. But so where BJC is on this is interesting because we don't like vouchers generally because it's public money to religious indoctrination. But we also don't like religious discrimination. And it's like a quiet part loud moment where like we've been saying for a long time, the narrative is they're trying to funnel money to Christian schools. And now they're showing you they're trying to funnel money to Christian schools. There is also the legislature in Florida is trying to do the same thing legislatively, not administratively, to exclude Muslims from their voucher program and outlaw Sharia law, which that's not new, trying to do that, but they're trying to do it again. So just, yes, careful what you wish for
Right.
is alive and well.
And you
in
also
this
defund public
iteration.
schools by allocating the money someplace else.
Exactly.
Right.
And
It's,
then you
it
have
is
the
part of a cycle of undermining
insiders and the
underfunding
outsiders in
public
terms of
schools, which are
education.
one of the few places that have to protect students' religious freedom under the Constitution. Public schools, because they're state actors, are bound by the religion clauses of the Constitution. Private schools are not.
Rewind a bit, you mentioned Doug, rewinding a
Oh, yeah,
bit.
Doug Wilson.
You mentioned Doug Wilson, is this the same Doug Wilson that is advising the Department of War?
Yes,
Oh,
he is Pete Hegseth's favorite pastor.
Even
Okay.
He spoke at one of the monthly Pentagon prayer meetings, rallies, I don't know what they call
Is
it.
he advising about the Holy War?
Yes, he does
Okay.
speak in some of those terms. He, yeah, I'm not saying I recommend listening to him, but I do think it's important to know what's out there. Like, I think he used to be fringe, and I don't think he's fringe anymore.
It's good to know, I mean, cause I know he advises the Secretary of War, like, on policy.
Defense.
Yeah.
You know, so it is concerning, because not only J.D. Vance, we're seeing a lot of these politicians go to pre-Vatican Council II type Catholicism, which is very anti-Semitic,
Yep.
and it's getting mainstream. And when you see the Reformation, Doug Wilson, very racist, misogynist, very Islamophobic, advising the Secretary of War.
Defense.
So, yeah, it is very,
The Doug Wilson example is interesting too, because back to your comment about so many different ways to interpret, when he talks, he will talk about like why he's allowed to make his beliefs eventually have the force of law because his are right, and his is the right way to interpret the Bible. Which fine, you're entitled to think your interpretation is right. Fine,
To
we all
yourself.
do on some level.
Yeah.
But the problem is he's a very particular strand of Reformed church. It's not a problem because of that. It's a problem that it's one strand of Christianity that wants to impose itself on the country. And I don't even know enough about Calvinism and the Reformed Church to speak intelligently about it, but it's not the same as a lot of other, even evangelical Christianity. And so if you want a situation where there's like violent fighting between Christians, then let's just keep going on the path we're on, because that is where this is headed, unfortunately. When I listen to some of his sermons and podcasts, whatever, chats, as much as he has no time for liberals and people who don't agree with him on that side, the people who get the most ire from him are actually like Southern Baptists.
Really?
Because they are like close enough to fundamentalists that he's sort of threatened by them, I think, but they also have, like, they care about racial reckoning, and some of them, loosely connected to them at least, have women in positions of leadership, not like true Southern Baptists, but connected denominations. So it's fascinating to watch them, because his boogeyman is not me so much as like Russell Moore at the who was at the Southern Baptist Convention, now Christianity Today. Oh, he throws barbs at Christianity Today all the time, because he sees it as this sort of like liberal loving, like pseudo-evangelical mouthpiece. I don't think it's that. I think it's a very thoughtful Christian view on the world. I mean, they are against abortion, I'll tell you that much, but they publish very thoughtful pieces about that. Maybe that's what he doesn't like. I don't know. But my point is that I just want to elevate again what you said about like heated differences about those different interpretations, more than we even know, because the kind of social contract about pluralism that is maybe at a low point right now protects us from that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the Establishment Clause is supposed to protect us from that kind of thing. But if people start to, that's another way we define Christian nationalism, as the worship of power rather than worship of God. And when you start to get enamored with that, then you want your view to have that power and to impose it, and it always has violent ends. Yeah.
How much do you think some of this dialogue and legislation will change when the proximity to power shifts?
It's a good question, because the president, whatever his own leanings are, has certainly made space for a lot of these viewpoints and people in his inner circle. And a lot of the executive agencies are issuing memos and statements that are, I think, shifting the focus on how to protect religious liberty in administering federal grants, trying to make it easier for religious organizations who take federal money to do religious stuff while they're giving out social services of whatever kind. And every department has some version of that now. So yes, good question. When it's a different person at the top, some of that will change at that level, but it doesn't change what's happening in states. One of the reasons we at BGC have begun to focus a lot more attention on state advocacy and grassroots organizing. And it depends on what state you're in, obviously. But in some ways it can be a lot easier for some of these leaders and ideas to take root in state legislatures, because you can much more easily organize and take control. And I think the one-party control on either side is like over the long term destructive, whichever party it is, frankly. Who was I talking to? A very progressive person who, I saw a presentation by Van Jones, who's like a civil rights leader and progressive activist, and they have a great talk about how progressives need to stop, progressives in New York and LA need to stop talking like colonizers, like the middle of the country is in need of like forcible conversion. And that, he said, like, I live in a blue state, super majority in California, and let me tell you, there's some real problems. And it's just a good reminder that, like, just having our people in power is not gonna solve everything, whoever our people are. So, to the broader question, I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. I do think having someone different at the top will help with setting a different tone, but I also worry that, like, if the pendulum swings really far the other way, then who does that person have in their orbit, and what kind of views come along with that? I will say, as a Jewish American, I've never really before in my life felt a little bit politically homeless until the last few years, and I've been feeling it, and that's a scary feeling. And I was born in 80. I grew up in the 90s and never really experienced anti-Semitism directly myself. Some people talk about that now as sort of a post-Holocaust bubble that has burst in terms of Jewish safety in America. That's a really scary thought, and I see it on the far right and the far left. Horseshoe that's become a donut, probably, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you look at, Tucker Carlson, whatever he's doing off the deep end, and he and Doug Wilson have some weird interviews that they've put online. And Israel is at the center of a lot of that conflict too, and how different Christians view their relationship to Israel and Jews. Yeah, it's a weird time.
Seems like one of the underlying motives for trying to post the Ten Commandments is control, where the divine intended it to be, these are ways you can become a better human.
Yeah.
And that gets back to, maybe this is a note to end on, really a Baptist pillar of thought called soul freedom or soul liberty at BJC, and that's sort of a Baptist theological principle. That anytime the government interferes, even ostensibly to advance or promote religion, is a violation of my religious freedom, even if it's my religion. Because it does what you're saying. It flattens, it distorts, and it screws up our loyalties and our sense of how to interpret these things. So I think that's a great way to think about it. I think we're at time, but if there's one more question we could. Yeah, one more. Okay.
I work in the public school system, and I'm wondering about the age appropriateness of many of the posting things that a kindergartner will see. How do you? I work in a middle school. If I were to explain some of these things, I put myself at great personal risk, because that child may go home and say something that a parent may view as grooming, or as offensive to their own personal view, that may get a teacher or a school professional in a lot of trouble. And I really find myself now today feeling a bit more concerned about the motives behind putting this in front of children.
It's a great set of questions, and one of the pieces of advice we're giving through our materials to public school teachers is to not answer questions very specifically and say, that's a question for your parents, just to protect themselves.
But even beyond that, like.
Yeah, I want to get the rest of it too.
Honoring your father and mother, how do you address that with a child who's being sexually abused?
Yeah, well, yes, thank you for that nuance, because that is a big part of the problem. And there is extensive Jewish commentary on that very question. Like, what does it mean to honor your father and mother if they're abusive or absent, or insert other scenarios? And there are interesting answers to that, but it needs to be engaged in a thoughtful way, right? And that's from a sectarian viewpoint. So I'm not saying a public school teacher should do that, no, but let's reserve those to faith communities, of course. By the way, there's a Ten Commandments bill in the Nebraska legislature right now.
Yeah.
The difference is, and I had to read this again because I was shocked, it also would require posting in private schools, in certain private schools. I'm not sure how they get away with that, but we'll see if it passes.
Yet.
It hasn't passed yet, but it is.
We voted down vouchers, and the legislature
Yes.
is now going to pass vouchers.
Yes.
Maybe.
It was on a public ballot, we said no.
That's because of the budget though.
Maybe.
Took it out of the budget.
Took it out of the
Yes,
budget, I think.
exactly.
I know that's a fight literally right now as we're speaking. Yeah. I was going to say something else to I wanted to mention the Nebraska thing, and then, the age appropriateness. Yes, that's a great question, and something that on the State Board of Education campaign we're working on, the teachers unions in particular, and superintendents and educators are hitting really hard, because you don't have to make a sectarian or diversity argument to say that there's a problem with age appropriateness. And also the fact that they're not linked to any curricular goals. Like, the job of the public school is to meet certain educational requirements.
Yeah.
What of this? What are we doing? Where does it fit in? Why are we doing this? So I think, leads me back to one other answer to your question, like, why is this happening now? I do think some of it is legislators signaling to their base that we're invested in this. Whether it passes or not, it's a signal that these are our values, or this is our identity. I do think that is also a factor. It's not unrelated to all the other things we raised, but I think there's a piece of it that is, why are we seeing it in so many of the state legislatures? Because they are trying to rally their base around certain things, who they are.
But as Jim said, they don't live up to any of that. So
That's
therefore.
another problem. Yeah.
No, but that would be with the nice Christian, and I'm a Christian. That would what the nationalist Christians should be asking about.
I don't know if you watched, when Texas legislature was debating SB 10, Representative Tallarico, who's now running for Senate, did do a line of questioning. It's a little bit cute, but he did do a line of questioning that was like, do you think the members of the state legislature should abide by the Ten Commandments?
Yes, I saw
that.
Yes, he challenged this one woman especially, yes.
Yeah, do you think we should not commit adultery? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Steal.
and then,
How about
right,
stealing?
I mean, yes, right.
Good gosh.
Right, I didn't really want to end on that note, but thank you, a great discussion, thank you so much.
Thank you.